Ready to move to the next level in your product career? I'm Shobhit from Intentional Product Manager. Join me as we discuss ways to help you stand out in your job search and your career so you can have more impact and make more money. Welcome back to the Intentional Product Manager podcast, where we dive deep into real stories, pivots, and product journeys behind some of today's top product leaders. I'm your host, Shobhit Shug, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by someone whose career spans consulting, big tech, fast-paced startups, and now he's redefining product within the venture capital world. So please welcome my friend Rahul Nath, Chief Product Officer at Accel, previously leading product at Drip Capital, and before that shaping Google Pay's merchant strategy. Rahul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Shobhit. Excited to be here.
Excellent. So Rahul, let's dig right in. You've had this fascinating journey. McKinsey, Google, Drip Capital, and now Accel. Tell me what drew you to product leadership in the first place?
To be honest, I think I've always been at some level a product person. Right from my very early roots in undergrad, we built a mobile application using J2ME back in the day. I built a couple of applications while I was doing some work at Citibank. So I think somewhere I was always excited about applying technology versus building technology. And I think without even realizing it, that was the product role that I was excited about. When I came from consulting to Google, to be honest, I started in like a strategy and operations role. And again, through conversations with product managers as part of my role, talking to friends who were in product management, it became obvious to me that that's where my passion really was. Um, and then I think the dots just connected at some point where I had this opportunity to work on product strategy for Google Payments. I realized a lot of the learning from my engineering days, together with what I learned in consulting, the 80/20 approach, thinking about prioritization, thinking about communication up and down the chain, just really set me up pretty well for that product leadership role. But end of the day, it's what you and I are excited about. It's about being able to deliver high impact, being able to thrive in a very ambiguous situation. It's challenging, but also deeply rewarding.
So then let's talk about some of the other transitions. So what were some of the biggest shifts you needed to make going from Google to Drip, from a very large company to a venture-backed scaling company?
A lot, to be honest, and there were plenty of mistakes that I could learn from, as you can imagine. When I first got to Drip, coming from Google, I was like, hey, I've been exposed to like this really high quality of product management, really smart product managers, really strong product processes, a really strong ecosystem around it. I have a lot that I can get started with on day one. And when I got to Drip, I was like, oh wow, we're missing like so much of the product process. The PRDs are not where they need to be. The product management function is not where it needs to be. So we spent a lot of time trying to build some of those processes. And a couple of months in, I realized I couldn't be more wrong about my approach here, because the thing that matters most when you're in a venture backed scaling startup is velocity, right? And I quickly realized there were actually a bunch of things that I had to unlearn to actually be successful in what I was trying to do. Fred had actually told me this when I was first stepping into the startup world. He'd been there for a while, and he was like, "Hey, if you're coming from Google, you have to unlearn a bunch of things." And I was just vehemently like, "Well, no, Google is like one of the best in class when it comes to building product. Why would I have to unlearn any of that stuff?" But I think his words rang true for me a couple of months into that transition. So some of the things that I realized I had to do quite differently or challenge myself on were first, um, ultimately, product management is I read this somewhere that it's always a trade-off between quality, speed, and cost, right? You can't have all three. You have to trade off on at least one or two of those dimensions. At Google, the trade-off was very clear. It was always about quality. Even if you have to go slower, even if you have to put more resources, it's about quality. And one thing I realized quickly is in the startup world, that assumption is definitely not valid. So in startup, in fact, speed and cost become a lot more important than quality. Not to say that quality doesn't matter, obviously, but you can ship things with a lot less polish than you can at a place like Google. I think in that sense, the Google's brand and the kind of scale at which you operate, it's a blessing and a curse in that sense, right? You can ship something with not enough polish at a place like Google, and you'll get slammed on social media and whatnot, right? So the risk is so much higher. But if you are at a startup, you can actually take a lot more risk in that regard. You can really, really focus on just the 80/20, just the most critical pieces, get those into a decent shape, get some decent level of user experience, and then iterate and get feedback. find some friendly customers, and iterate from there. But that speed is so much more critical than getting to like a high level of polish. That was like one of the first learnings, and that took a while to kind of get to. Second part is balancing costs. Again, at a place like Google, you have the best of product managers, engineers. You have a massive support team around you, UX, market research, product analytics, and so forth. You come to a startup, a lot of those things don't exist. We tried building those initially, and then we quickly realized, hey, this is not really wieldy for a setup like ours. And so I think the big lesson for me there was don't try to build everything in house. There is a very active discussion to be had about build versus buy. And especially for initial iterations, it might actually be a lot less risky to just buy something, iterate on that, figure out the product market fit, and then go build what you really need to build in house. So, really, really focus on the core of what you need to build. Again, very different mindset from coming from Google, where we literally built, like, if we built our own CRM, right? That was the second thing. I think the last thing for me was, again, at Google, you would spend a lot of time crafting like this great product vision, this 5-year vision that you're going to then embark on and execute against. In the startup world, I don't think that applies. It's still good to have a vision. It's good to have a direction of where you want to go, but that vision needs to be very flexible. It needs to be challenged every 3 to 6 months because the environment you're in is just so dynamic. You're going to get so much more input and feedback from your customers. Your business is going to see so much more evolution as you go through it. So that vision needs to be a lot more dynamic than what I was used to in like being in a place like Google.
That's super helpful. In hindsight, some of these, like, obviously that makes sense, but it's really hard to like learn on the job. But it's great to be able to reflect back and share your learnings with the rest of the community. Okay, so let's talk about now a very interesting move. Accel, one of the most well-known venture capital firms. I don't think many people, including maybe even me, have a mental model for what product even means being inside a VC firm. So tell us more, how does your role look like and what your mission there is?
To be honest, it's a new role for Accel. I think it's a relatively new role in the VC space as well. So a lot of people are trying to wrap their heads around what this even means. In my first few days, I think the number one question I got asked was, so what are you really going to do? So even, within the company, there were a lot of questions around what does this even mean, right? I think the way I think about my role at a very high level is how do we use technology to supercharge the entire investment process and operations, right? If you think about our business, there are really three core elements to it. The first, most critical thing is finding great companies to invest in, right? This is the sourcing process. How do you go about identifying those handful of companies that you want to take a big bet on and that you want to help grow? The second is once you've made those bets, how do you cultivate those relationships? How do you help both the portfolio companies as well as keep our investors, our LPs, updated on our progress with our portfolio, right? So it's managing our relationships both with our portfolio companies and with our LPs. And then the third part of it is running an efficient operation, where you think about accounting, finance, legal, reporting, compliance. There's a whole bunch of requirements there. There's a whole machinery that needs to operate there. So the question is, how do all these systems play well together? And my job is to look end to end across this entire spectrum and say, how do we build/buy things and put them together in a way that they can work together in tandem to deliver the most efficient and effective operation that we can drive. So in some part, there is, our general philosophy is buy where possible, right? We are very cognizant that we are not a technology company. We are not a product-led company. We don't aspire to be one. But at the same time, and there is some great tech out there that we can leverage. The challenge is a lot of this tech is not just usable, at least at our scale, is not just turnkey. It's not just, you simply bring it on and it starts to work. You have to really tie it into your data infrastructure. You have to tie it across applications. The right data needs to feed in. People need to be trained on it. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to happen that is more kind of producty in nature in that sense. And then there are some aspects where we really haven't found very good applications off the shelf. So that's where the real product work is designing what that experience needs to look like and then executing against that.
Now, it's also seen as very human-driven industry. Relationships are key. I mean, reputations of the investors is key. What are some of the challenges in applying product thinking to this kind of industry?
I think first off, like I mentioned, it's a new role for the company. It's a new role, relatively newer role for the industry. There's a healthy dose of skepticism, right? And it's not because people don't believe in technology. We've all been trying to embrace technology for a while, and we do use it in multiple parts of our processes. I think the challenge has been the technology itself has been evolving. And when you move from the public to the private markets where we live, a lot of the data, a lot of the information we're looking for can be a lot harder to access. In some cases, you're still sort of guessing at certain things. And even just looking back, 2 to 3 years, the kind of data sources that we could leverage, the accuracy, the coverage of those data sources was somewhat limited. So when you've had that experience with that and it's not been great, and if you've missed out on a great opportunity because the data was not right, you can quickly put your hands up and say, yeah, I'm just going to rely on what I think works. So understandably, there is a bias towards relying on current processes and doing things. We've been very fortunate in that Accel's had a really strong track record. We've been able to do really really well in our space, and so there isn't that case of like a burning platform, that strong case for change right away, right? Which makes things a little bit more interesting from a product adoption standpoint. As you well know, anyways, driving change management can be tricky. It's harder when you don't have a very, very compelling case for change right away. But then there's the strong recognition too that this is there is so much more that technology can bring with the recent advances in compute, in AI, and so forth. There's a ton of efficiency to be gained. There is a way for us to be able to much more comprehensively study the startup ecosystem, make better investment decisions, run a more efficient operation. So that recognition is there, but I think there's a real change management aspect that comes with it. So that's one big aspect of it. The other is, again, since this is a relatively new function, a lot of the processes, infrastructure, and culture that is required to execute against this doesn't really exist. I see this with a lot of, I see financial firms where a lot of development, for example, is outsourced. Now, there's a lot of value to that, right? It gives you a lot of flexibility. You don't have to worry about hiring, nurturing, retaining technical talent, which is quite different from what you're used to doing on a day to day basis. But I think the flip side of it is you don't really get that longevity in your tech stack. You don't really get that strategic thinking in terms of how you invest in technology in a way that can grow with the changes in technology. So it's sort of building that culture, building that setup, building that function, building that layer of processes. That's the other aspect of this.
How does success look like for product at Accel? Is it adoption, some sort of leverage, velocity? How do you look at success?
See, to me, adoption ultimately is a means to an end. You need adoption for there to be impact, assuming that the product can actually drive impact, right? Um, but ultimately, the way I would measure our success is back to the classic ROI metric, right? And ROI for Accel. So return for us is basically what return can we bring to our investors. Ultimately, that's what we are measured by. That's what the industry measures us by. So can we improve the returns that we bring to our investors? Can we actually help drive better investment decisions by making data available at the right times, by improving the quality of the data that's available, by reducing the operational overhead for our investment team so they can actually focus on the more meaningful value add stuff in the process, right? So that's the return aspect to me. And then the investment part is, can I reduce the costs of doing all of this? So if by building a more efficient operation, by simplifying some of our backend processes, by moving those into the cloud, by really leveraging AI where we can to simplify parts of that process, can we again reduce the overhead associated with managing our operation? Those are the two big elements that I would measure our success by.
We talked a bit about your thinking of buy where possible and all these things, but we see tech stack would probably be fairly fragmented. So how do you think of building a more unified product-centric platform?
I think if I look at the VC landscape right now, what's happened is there's been an explosion of data providers and tools to manage the VC process. To a point where you have the, of course, sourcing and workflow management upfront, but even things like portfolio management, just better note taking, CRMs, valuations, document management. They're like point solutions for all of these different aspects. So there's a lot of complexity that this introduces. It's exciting because you have these great solutions that can do a lot more than what you could do, even a few years ago, and they're constantly getting better with the introduction of AI and different aspects of it. But it also adds a ton of complexity. And if I think about, for example, our investment team, the number one thing that every investor is limited on is bandwidth, is time. And they'd love to be spending every single minute talking to more founders, talking to more companies, and looking for the next great investment opportunity. I don't think you'll find a single investor who's excited about learning a new technology tool, a new technology platform, right? But the reality of it is, all these platforms require a significant amount of onboarding, of understanding how to navigate them, their UX, and so forth. And so you have this equation where you have a lot more available right now. It takes time to learn all this. Time is limited and actually getting even more sparse with just the velocity of what we are seeing happen with the next generation of companies, just how quickly new companies are getting created, they're scaling. Everything is just accelerated so much more in the last couple of years, right? So how do you solve this tension is part of the question. Our approach to this is to think about aggregation in some sense, which is, we look at a number of these tools and we've realized none of them, at least to us, is a runaway winner in every dimension. They all have their advantages in certain aspects of the process. Uh, so then it's a question of, hey, can we tie the best of all of these together into our own aggregation platform, control that UX, and make it really easy for investors to access specific parts of these tools in a way that's intuitive, in a way that ties into our investment process, and in a way that we keep it all under one roof, and really all they need to learn is this one single platform versus like 15 to 20 other underlying platforms. So we obfuscate all of that complexity and create a much more simplified layer on top of it.
That's very helpful. And like, I love the thinking of your customers, your investors, the partners, and their time being so valuable. And how do you reduce the cognitive effort to them to start learning new tools?
I think a large part of the value of these tools comes from being able to use them easily and in context of what you're trying to do. And that's the problem we're trying to go after.
Let's talk a bit more about your own transitions and like some of the market shifts. So 2023, you transitioned out of Drip during a tough macro environment, especially job search in tech. Can you walk us through your job search and how you navigated the shifting hiring landscape at that time?
I'll be honest, it was a stressful time, right? The market is where it is. Opportunities are limited. There's a lot of great talent on the market. Um, so it was uh, it was tough navigating those few months, looking for kind of my next play. I think networking was key. Really tapping, folks in places that I was interested in looking at. What I found really heartening was just the number of people who were willing to make time and go out of the way to help in any way that they could. So there's a lot of support and a lot of encouragement in that process to kind of look for to help identify like the next opportunity. Um, I spent some time talking to a few executive recruiters just to get a sense for where the opportunities were, what kind of roles were in demand, um, how I could position myself for some of those opportunities given my background. And then I think the key for me was just casting a pretty wide net, looking all the way from like very small companies all the way through to big tech, and looking at roles that could potentially fit with my background, where I thought I had a good story and I could bring value on day one. And that led to a bunch of initial conversations and discussions. Accel was is an investor in my previous company, Drip Capital, and that's how we got started talking about this opportunity. And it was a new role for them. It took a little while for us to kind of work through and figure out how we do this. For me to kind of do some background research as well into the VC landscape, realize there's a ton of opportunity to bring value to this ecosystem and just the impact that that can have on the startup ecosystem at large. And then that's how eventually things worked out.
I love two things you said. One was about that people were willing to help, and then the second about like you thinking about how do you position yourself for different kind of role where there would be a real fit. Tell me more about the networking piece. So it's common advice that hey, you should go network. Like what are maybe some of the top few things you did that were really worth it for your time and the effort you were putting in?
That's a good question. I certainly wouldn't describe myself as a networking expert. And I know it's an area that's uncomfortable for a lot of us, myself included. It's not something that I'm naturally inclined to do. Um, I'd say some of the things that were helpful were one, being genuine about where you are, what you're trying to solve for, what your constraints are, what kind of opportunities you're looking for. To being being curious, what are the kind of things that you are seeing? Where are you seeing opportunities in your space? What are you hearing in terms of different types of companies, different types of markets, different type of industries, and so forth, right? And then the third thing is just looking to learn from people's experiences. Hey, if you made this transition recently, how did you go about that? What was your experience like? And I think the fourth thing is, if it's possible, like where can I offer you something off the bat? Is there value I can bring to you, either because you're in an industry that I might know something about, or you're in a function where you're trying to solve a problem that I might have had some experience with. Um, I realized that I was approaching networking from a very one-way relationship standpoint initially, of like, I am looking to get help. But I also realized along the way that I could also offer help along the process. And that made it feel a lot more comfortable for me, at least.
With that lens, with this transition lens and you what you went through, how are you seeing product management evolve in today's market?
Things still remain pretty challenging where it comes to the number of opportunities, the competition against those opportunities is still a very sought after function. Um, but at the same time, I think it's also a really exciting time uh, to be in the world of technology in general, or to be engaged with technology in any way, shape, or form. There's a ton of change happening with AI, as we know. There are tools now to automate multiple parts of every process, including the product process. I've seen some that allow you to write pretty high quality PIDs with very little input. There are ways to simplify or accelerate customer research, market landscape research, competitive research, and so forth. Preparing communications, preparing slides has gotten a lot easier. And now with no code platforms, you can actually build some pretty decent prototypes with very little effort, right? So all of that, I think, opens up a lot more avenues to experiment with things. But I think it also brings with it a level of competition, right? Now, everything is a lot more dynamic. So what we're seeing now is much faster shipping cycles, shorter feedback loops. I think the need to just rapidly absorb what you're hearing and adapt to it becomes a lot more critical than it was before, perhaps. So more intensity, perhaps, a lot more need to um, engage and quickly learn from what you're seeing and be able to adapt your product. But I think the focus on the core skills still remains. And as with a lot of other things, I think there's a lot of good here, because a lot of the operational parts of the job are getting automated, which means it frees you up to do a lot more of the critical thinking part and the relationship part, which are like two critical elements of the product function, right? So thinking about, again, the 80/20, really going deep on latent customer needs, figuring out, thinking through how you measure and communicate impact, and then really building those cross-functional relationships that are so critical to being successful in a product management role. So I think all of those aspects very much remain intact. And if anything, with what you're seeing, it opens up the time to be able to focus a lot more on those critical aspects.
I'll ask you for one more piece of advice. Like with this view, what advice would you offer for PMs who are early on in their career?
The number one thing I would say is never stop learning. I think especially in this environment, more now than ever before, there's so much happening, and there's such great tools to play around with, to experiment with, to get your hands dirty with some of the stuff that's happening. So roll up your sleeves, keep doing that, keep learning. I think one of my favorite quotes from, I think this was the last lecture, was something along the lines of success happens when luck meets preparation. And I think I'm probably distorting it, but somewhere along those lines. But I think the luck part you can't control. So focus on the controllables, which is your preparation. The more that you can get acquainted with, the more things that you interact with, engage with, the more you'll have to tell in terms of stories, the more ideas you'll have when you go to those product interviews. The more you can talk about, the more you're aware of what tech can do, the more ideas you can come up with in terms of how to improve a process, a product, a company.
Okay, Rahul, we're going to put you in the hot seat. To close out, we'll do a couple of rapid fire closing. Whatever the first answer comes to you, let us know and we'll use that to wrap up this. What's a book or resource that's influenced your product thinking recently?
Build by Tony Fadell. It's a great book. I thought it was just very genuine. Tony Fadell is the guy behind iPod, Nest. Just a very genuine, very heartfelt account of the passion around building products. I really enjoyed that read.
What's the biggest myth about product leadership?
I'd say that product leaders have all the answers and the clarity on what needs to happen in the next couple of years. You really just have a strong hypothesis, and you're going to test it through a bunch of experiments. And chances are you'll be somewhere between 30 to 80% right.
Maybe one thing you wish you knew before becoming a chief product officer.
That it's going to be a constant, never ending game of choices. You make choices like every single day, and it's going to really, really push your decision making abilities, all the way from like small, tiny UX level decisions all the way to major kind of strategic bets that you're going to make.
Coffee, tea, Diet Coke, Coke, or VC backed energy drinks?
That's an easy one. I'm a chai person, and masala tea to be specific.
And then what's next for you and Accel in 2025?
I think, like I said, my mandate is how do we turbocharge the VC process at Accel with the use of technology. So I'm excited about how we apply that in a more concerted, cohesive way across our entire stack, and help bring more goodness to what we do.
First of all, thank you so much for appearing on this podcast. This was a masterclass in product thinking, in how you think about your career, in networking, in impact. So thanks again for joining us on the Intentional Product Manager podcast. How do people learn more from you and follow you? Is LinkedIn the best way or any other ways?
Well, first of all, this was really fun. Thank you for having me again, Shobhit. Best way to get in touch with me, LinkedIn probably is the most effective mechanism.
Thanks again and have a wonderful day. And for everyone who's watching this on YouTube, or maybe you're on Spotify or Apple or one of the million other podcast platforms, just make sure you hit like, subscribe, whatever your platform allows, and do leave a review because we love to hear from those. I love those comments and use it to make the podcast better. Thanks again for listening. Hey, be sure to check out our website at intentionalproductmanager.com to see how you can level up in your career.